Hello, everyone. I'm back, and in this set of video lectures, we're going to talk about documentation basics. Before we can understand auditing, we have to understand the basics about how medical records are organized. And even though this has gotten more complicated with electronic health record systems, there are some core principles, and that's what we're going to get into in this chapter. Your text talks about the problem-oriented medical record, which the format includes many of the things that we see today. That includes the problem list, which we'll talk about more throughout the course, the history, the physical exam, laboratory findings, and the plan of care. The problem-oriented medical record system recognized 4 distinct elements of clinical decision-making. That included collecting all the data on the patient, formulating problems, formulating a management plan on how we're going to deal with said problems, reviewing the medical problems, and revising the plan when necessary. The problem-oriented medical record was not widely adopted per se in its original format out of the United Kingdom, but a lot of the concepts still are with us today. And they address the whys of the documentation, as we'll see here. Why do we document? Well, basically, we want to have a method where we can collect vital statistics. We saw great examples of this with COVID-19 and not so great examples in the sense that states were capturing data differently about what was a COVID hospitalization or death and what was not, right? So you want to have consistency. The other thing is that the medical record acts as a legal document, not just in terms of demonstrating what type of quality of care the patient received, but also in terms of coding, billing, and compliant billing as a defense against False Claims Act and some of the other laws that we have discussed. It also justifies to the payer what is going to be actually billed. And then, of course, quality of care, as mentioned, right? By reviewing the medical record, it serves as a roadmap to discovering what kind of quality of care the patient received. Medical records are kept in either paper or electronic format, but they still kind of follow these types of labels, if you will. We have outpatient office visits, we have consults, we have medication records, we have the records of what was prescribed for the patient or ordered for the patient. We have immunizations, diagnostic tests, x-rays, imaging, MRIs, surgical services, op reports, pathology reports, hospital records, and so on. The medical record is basically the central repository of all the information that's generated during the patient's clinical encounter, be it a hospitalization or an outpatient encounter. It aids to memory, acts as support for continuity of care, and basically provides a record of witness for legal purposes, financial purposes, and regulatory purposes. If you think about it, how are we going to know what the ratios are for staffing unless you have records of nurses documenting in nursing progress notes? How are we going to know for open heart surgery that there was an assistant surgeon on an urgent case and what their credentials were unless it's documented in the medical record, right? So very important to think of these in terms of legal. And when we think about legal documents in terms of medical records, we always think malpractice. It goes a little bit above and beyond. And medical records basically assist with both internal and external audits, as we've talked about, insurance carriers to support the services that were billed and support medical necessity. Back in the day when we had paper records, this involves Xerox machines and mailing things, certified mail, and so on. Now, of course, we can do this all electronically. And that's all I have for this lecture. Come back for the next one where we'll talk about authentication, signatures, and other critical components of documentation. Bye now.